As well as learning about the past, today hopes to inspire a better future. This is a day of great significance for me because, referring to the title of the lecture, I have my own personal story. My father was born and raised in a small town called Tarnów near Krakow. He wanted to be a doctor, and indeed he eventually became a talented orthopedic surgeon. At the age of 18, just before the Nazi invasion of Poland, my grandparents sent him to France to study medicine. They did so because of something that was known as the numerus clausus rule, which was effectively prohibiting Jews from studying medicine or indeed law in Poland. Poland was rife with anti-Semitism long before the Nazi invasion. So he left for a foreign country whose language he could barely speak, and he never saw his parents again. They were 2 of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. So as you can imagine, this is a special day for me, and it is a great sadness that I never had the chance to meet my paternal grandparents. Now, let me say a few words about tonight's speaker, Master Philippe Sands. He has had and continues to enjoy a very distinguished career. He is a polymath, a jurist, an academic, an advocate, a celebrated author, and a broadcaster. He is one of the founders of Matrix Chambers. He was called to the bar by Middle Temple in 1985, and he took silk in 2003. He became a bencher of the Inn in 2009. He is a professor of law at UCL and director of its Center of International Courts and Tribunals. He's an expert on international remedies in so many fields: trade disputes, environmental law, and interstate claims. He has appeared as counsel before so many international courts and tribunals. They include the International Court of Justice, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, and the International Criminal Court. He has helped bring the principles of international law into play in the domestic courts. As well as this, he serves on the panel of arbitrators at the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes and the Court of Arbitration for Sport. In his spare time, he's the author of 17 books on international law. And since 2018, he has been the president of English Pen, an organization which champions the freedom to write and the freedom to read around the world. He's a member of the board of the Hayes Festival. His book, East-West Street, has been translated into 20 languages. Last year, he wrote a book entitled The Ratline: Loves, Lies, and Justice on the Trail of a Nazi Fugitive. This is about the disappearance of a senior Nazi, Otto Wachter, investigating the rat lines, so-called, by which he escaped justice. And I dare say you may hear a little more about that this evening. As Marlene has indicated, at the end of his talk, there will be an opportunity for questions. Please do send them on the chat function. And without more ado, it now gives me the greatest of pleasure to welcome Philippe Sands.
Thank you so much, Master Treasurer. Thank you so much, dear Andrew, and my sincere thanks to Krista and Johnny and Merlene and the whole team at Middle Temple. Middle Temple is an enormously important place for me, and I'm really very privileged and proud to be with you all tonight. It's a special place, a special community. We're meeting on Holocaust Memorial Day. This, as Master Treasurer mentioned, is a date of particular resonance, and I'll say a bit more about that in due course. I should say that for me, it's a moment not just to commemorate those who were murdered between 1933 and 1945, but also a moment to reflect upon all acts of mass atrocity, crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, and so on and so forth. And for many people in the audience, you will have been touched in different ways in your family lives and the lives of your friends by different aspects. So I think for me, the day is broad. It has a central focus, but it is broader and looks to the totality of the horrors that have happened over the last decades and centuries. Now, some of you may well have read my book, East West Street, and a few, perhaps two, also the sequel, The Ratline. The stories that they tell, like the cases in which I'm involved, inevitably involve personal stories. And it's that connection between the minutiae of the personal story and the larger canvas of the political, legal, public stories that is, I think, of interest to me. East West Street and the Ratline are part of a broader project. Around 2010, I came to meet the sons of two senior Nazis, Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, and Horst Wächter, the son of Otto Wächter. They were actually the sons of two senior Nazis who were directly involved in the extermination of my own grandfather's family, and actually, I suspect, of Master Treasurer's family. And my connection with them came about entirely unexpectedly. I wasn't looking for personal stories. In the 1960s, my brother and I would often visit our grandparents. They lived in Paris, near the Gare du Nord, which some of you will know. And as children, we understood that their past, the past for them, was painful. We shouldn't ask questions. The apartment was, like many people who lived through that period, a place of silence, one haunted by secrets. Those silences only really began to be addressed for me when I was in my 50s, when I received an invitation to deliver a lecture in a city called Lviv in Ukraine. Come and talk about the cases that you do at international courts on crimes against humanity and genocide. I went to Lviv, and one thing led to another. I looked for and found the house where my grandfather, Leon Buchholz, was born in 1904. I learned of the terrible events that occurred in that city, unleashed by the words of Governor General Hans Frank, a lawyer, and the man who ran Nazi-occupied Poland, spoken on a warm day in August 1942, directed to his deputy, Otto Wächter, sitting in the front row of the aula at the university, who had recently been transferred to Lemberg to be governor of District Galicia. Hans Frank's words, in effect, exterminated my grandfather's family and hundreds of thousands of other families. Frank was charged with crimes against humanity and genocide, and he was hanged in the court of Nuremberg's Palace of Justice for crimes against humanity 75 years ago at the end of the Nuremberg trial. In going back to Lviv, I learned too that the man who put crimes against humanity into international law, Hirsch Lauterpacht, came from the city of Lviv, which was also called Lemberg or Lvov. Indeed, Lauterpacht was a student at its university, although those who invited me to give the lecture were blissfully unaware of that fact. And I also learned, amazingly, that the man who invented the word genocide, Raphael Lemkin, also passed through Lviv and extraordinarily studied at the same law faculty in the university, although at a different time as Lauterpacht. Again, those who invited me were not aware of that fact. And then I learned, all of this in a sense accidentally, that at Nuremberg, in the famous trial, Lauterpacht and Lemkin actually prosecuted Hans Frank, respectively, for crimes against humanity and genocide. But when the trial opened on the 20th of November 1945, they were not aware that the man they were prosecuting was responsible for the deaths of their entire families. 6 years after that first visit to Lviv, I published East West Street. It's not about the life of one individual, but four. The book seeks to understand how the particular circumstances of each man contributed to the road he took and how the different roads they traveled changed the system of international law that is my daily work and the daily work of so many other people. Many of you will know that the book also touches a more personal theme, how the four interweaving lives of these men influence the path that I've taken, directly or indirectly, in the law. Below this path, of course, lurk some much larger questions, questions that touch each and every one of us, that go at their heart to a matter of identity. Who am I? How do I wish to be defined? As an individual or as a member of a group? How do we want the law to protect us? As individuals or as members of a group? It was probably my work as a barrister rather than my academic writings that caused the invitation to be sent from that university in Lviv. In the summer of '98, I was peripherally involved in the negotiations that led to the creation of the International Criminal Court, a body that would have jurisdiction over genocide and crimes against humanity, as well as two other international crimes. The essential difference between the two concepts is on who is protected and why. Assume 10,000 people are killed, murdered, exterminated. The systematic killing of such numbers of individuals will inevitably be a crime against humanity. But will it be a genocide? In law, that depends on the intentions of the killers and the ability of prosecutors to prove that intention. To establish the crime of genocide, you have to show that the act of killing is motivated by a special intent, namely the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. If a criminal prosecutor can't prove that a large number of people have been killed with that intent, then the crime of genocide under international law will not be established. What this means is you've got these two international crimes operating side by side and overlapping. Every genocide is also a crime against humanity, but not every crime against humanity will be a genocide. A few weeks after the two crimes were inscribed into the statute of the ICC, Senator Pinochet was arrested in London on charges, interestingly enough, of genocide and crimes against humanity, laid against him by a Spanish prosecutor. The House of Lords eventually ruled that even as a former president of Chile, he was not entitled to claim immunity from the English courts. That was a novel and revolutionary and significant judgment. In the years that followed, the gates of international justice creaked open quite slowly after 5 decades of relative quiescence during the Cold War chill that descended after Nuremberg. Cases from the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda soon arrived on my desk in chambers in London. Others followed, relating to allegations in the Congo, Libya, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Sierra Leone, Guantanamo, Iraq, Palestine, Israel, and so on. These were always based on the new rules that were created at that moment in 1945, a revolutionary moment in the making of modern international law, a moment that began in courtroom 600 of Nuremberg's Palace of Justice, the moment when it was recognized for the first time in human history that the right of the sovereign over its people is not unlimited. The long and sad list of cases that reached me reflected the failure of good intentions aired in courtroom 600. I became involved in too many cases of mass killing. Some concerned crimes against humanity, the killing of individuals on a large scale. Others gave rise to allegations of genocide, the destruction of groups. These two distinct crimes, with their different emphases on the individual and the group, grew side by side, although over time, genocide seems to have emerged in the eyes of many as the crime of crimes, a hierarchy that leaves a suggestion that somehow the killing of vast numbers of people as individuals rather than as a group is somehow less terrible. Hans Frank's son, Nicholas, is a significant character in my book, East-West Street. He is a distinguished journalist and writer, and he despises his father. Indeed, he said to me the very first time I met him, "You have to understand, Philippe, I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except the case of my father." I'm delighted actually to say that just today, it's been announced that his book, The Father, published in Germany in 1987, will be published this year in English in England for the first time. It was he who introduced me to Horst Arthur Wächter, the son of his father's deputy, Otto Wächter, an Austrian, and like his father, also a lawyer. Amazingly, Wächter entered the University of Vienna Law School in October 1919 on the same day as Hirsch Lauterpacht. Wächter became governor of Krakow, later governor of District Galicia, based in Lviv. Wächter, the father, was indicted for mass murder, more than 100,000 Poles and Jews. But unlike Hans Frank, he was never caught. He died in Rome in 1949 in mysterious and unexpected circumstances. You will like Horst, Nicholas said to me. Although he is different from me, he loves his father. And so in the spring of 2012, I make the first of many visits to Horst, to the dilapidated 12th century castle, the Schloss, in the village of Hagenberg, north of Vienna. Horst, who's in his early 70s then, is genial and chatty and dressed in a pink shirt and Birkenstocks. We talk, we eat, we drink. He tells me of his parents' Nazi beliefs, his deep love for his mother, Charlotte, a Nazi until the day she died in 1985, Horst's wife, Jacqueline, will whisper to me, and how he had a childhood of plenty. I was a Nazi child, he says to me with a big grin. I was named in honor of the Horst Wessel song and Arthur Seyss-Inquart, my father's friend, who ran Austria after the Anschluss. Seyss-Inquart later became governor of German-occupied Holland, and it was Horst's godfather. I was surprised indeed that Horst sleeps with a photograph of his godfather right next to his bed. His godfather was hanged at Nuremberg, a couple of defendants after Frank. But, Horst says, I hardly knew my father. It is, however, my duty as a son to find the good in my father. On that first visit, Horst shares with me albums filled with black and white photos from the 1930s and 40s. There are images of family holidays, lakes, mountains, the odd swastika here and there, a picture of Adolf Hitler, a haunting photograph of a child in the Warsaw Ghetto. What the scrapbook makes clear is that the Wächters sat at the top Nazi table. And there is too an extensive collection of his parents' diaries and letters and Charlotte's reminiscences, but these I will see only much, much later. I leave at the end of that first visit totally intrigued by Horst and his family papers, and I like him, as Nicholas said I would. A year passes. I write a profile of Horst for the Financial Times. He doesn't like it, severs our relationship, but then comes back. The article catalyzes a commission for a BBC documentary, My Nazi Legacy, which traces my relationship with Nicholas and Horst, and we travel together to Lviv, Lemberg. Horst doesn't like the film either, once more severs our relations, once more return. But one scene in the film really irritates him. In Lviv, at the city archives, Nicholas wonders aloud whether Horst might be a new kind of Nazi. Nicholas, in fact, later retracts the suggestion. Horst wants to counter the claim. I don't think of you as a Nazi, I say to him. But, he says, how can I prove that I'm not a Nazi? That question he puts to me is an interesting one. I reflect upon it. As lawyers, we know proving a negative is never an easy thing. Eventually, I come up with a solution. Why not give all the family material, the archive, to a museum? And in that way, scholars and others who are interested can review the family archive. It seems to be a unique collection, one that traces the life of a leading couple, Otto and Charlotte, from the moment they met in 1929 to Otto's death in July 1949 in Rome. Horst agrees. He offers the material to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., where it is digitized and made public. Just last month, it was all put online. All you need to do is Google Wächter Holocaust Museum, and you too can have access to everything. You can dip in. It is extraordinary material. Would I like a set? Horst asks me. Yes, I reply. A few days later, a single USB stick drops through my letterbox. 13 gigabytes of digital images, 8,677 pages of letters, postcards, diaries, photographs, news clippings, and official documents. The collection is indeed remarkable. It includes Charlotte's Erinnerungen, memoirs, written for Horst and the couple's 5 other children, reminiscences grouped by date, 1938 to 1942, 1942 to 1945, 1945 to 1949, and so on. Amazingly, there are also turnbenders, sound recordings, 14 old cassette tapes, digitized, which allow me to hear Charlotte's German cadence, methodical and rhythmic, high-pitched, anxious, not a warm voice. The totality of the material allows me to see the private side of Governor Wächter's nefarious work in Krakow and Lemberg from 1939 to 1944. What exactly did he do? Why did he travel to Rome in the spring of 1949? What caused him to die there at a relatively young age? How much did his wife Charlotte know about what he did, and what support did she provide? What was their relationship like? The material is voluminous, mostly handwritten. It lingers at my house for several weeks until a colleague of mine, wonderful late historian Lisa Jardine, intercedes. She had recently delivered an inaugural lecture at University College London with the wonderful title, Temptation in the Archives. Many of you will know I love archives almost like nothing else. But her question was, how do you assess archival material of a personal nature? And what's the historical value of personal documents? Lisa is terminally ill with cancer, but she summons a few of us to her flat in the shadow of the British Museum. Bring a few documents along, she says, I'd like to see them. I bring a few things and she gravitates towards the personal correspondence and diaries. And she's struck by the sheer number of letters written in the last months of Otto's life while he was on the run, hunted by the Americans, the British, the Soviets, and the Jews for mass murder, for genocide, for crimes against humanity. Why would a husband and wife write to each other so often, at such length and in such detail, she asks me. Because they loved each other, I venture. No, she replies. There's a lot more to it than that. There's more there. They're sharing things they don't want others to see. The letters from the last years, after the war was over, when Otto was on the run, are coded. There are no names. They didn't want to know, other people to know who they were writing about. Lisa says, focus on the last year of Otto's life and the nature of Charlotte's role, and let's see what we can find. And so begins another research project, one that lasts 5 years, an exploration of what lay between the lines and behind the words around the Holocaust. I stumble into a world of escape and espionage, of double dealing and duplicity, of exhumations and reburials. I travel from the Vatican to Syria to South America, into monasteries over lakes across mountains, and I enter the world of the Ratline, the Reich migratory route, as it was known, the escape route used by indicted, hunted Nazis to make their way from Italy to Argentina and other places. What I will learn is barely imaginable. It's a story of love and lies and of justice. A couple fleeing from the prospect and fear of discovery and arrest, of charge and trial, of sentencing and the inevitable noose. At the heart of the story is a relationship, one that survived, the wife believed, because our love was without any limits and even went beyond death. Those are her words. Charlotte fascinates and she repels. She was born into a wealthy family of steelmakers in the small Styrian town of Mürzzuschlag, and she was, on her own account, a difficult and rebellious child, intelligent, but perhaps not intellectual. She enrolled as a student at the Women's Academy and School for Free and Applied Arts. She developed a fine artistic eye, helped by teachers like the famous Josef Hoffmann of the Wiener Werkstätte. Her career blossomed, designing fabrics sold with great success in Germany and Britain. She was also a very fine sportswoman, and in the spring of 1929, she traveled to the local ski resort near Vienna, Schneeberg, sharing a train compartment with a stranger, a strikingly handsome young lawyer. My new baron was tall, slender, athletic, with delicate features and very beautiful hands, she recorded. He wore a diamond ring on the little finger of his right hand, and he had a noble appearance, one that any girl would notice. On the 6th of April 1929, she wrote in her diary, "I fell in love with good-looking, cheerful Otto." They courted for 3 years before marriage, a result of her unintended pregnancy. He starts to practice as a lawyer and becomes increasingly active in the Austrian chapter of the Nazi Party. She totally supports and encourages his politics. In the summer of 1934, Otto led the unsuccessful coup attempt on the government of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, parentheses, perhaps not so dissimilar to what happened on the 6th of January at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. He fled to Berlin and joined the criminal division of the Sicherheitsdienst, or the SD, the infamous and notorious intelligence service of the SS. He worked in the same building as Adolf Eichmann. He entered the orbit of Heinrich Himmler, who became his patron. Charlotte joined him in Berlin in 1936 with Horst's 2 oldest siblings. In March 1938, Germany seized Austria and the couple were able to return home. Every Nazi felt such joy about this miracle, Charlotte recorded. She drove from Berlin to Vienna to pave the way for her husband's triumphant return. And there he was, she wrote, in the doorway of my parents' flat in Vienna as a Brigadeführer in his black SS coat with white lapels and SS uniform. In spite of the strain and the fatigue, he looked totally splendid. They made their way to the Hofburg Palace through crowds overcome with a spontaneous and heartfelt outburst of joy. She wrote, Seyss-Inquart and his wife and a number of others came with the Führer, who slowly climbed the stairs of the Hofburg up to the balcony. The Führer was standing just a meter in front of me. I could see him and hear him so well. At the bottom of those stairs after the event, she told Otto he should accept Seyss-Inquart's offer of a senior job in the new Nazi government, rather than return to the ordinary, lucrative, but unattractive life of a lawyer. The decision would have enormous consequences. It changed their lives as well as that of their children and grandchildren. Charlotte's diaries pass in total silence on the substance of Otto's new position. As a state secretary in the new Nazi government, his job was to remove Jews and other undesirables from public office, from the federal chancellor at the top to the postal service at the bottom. He axed thousands of individuals, including 2 of his own university teachers, Professor Joseph Hupke and Professor Stefan Braslov. Removed from their posts at the University of Vienna by his action in the summer of 1938, they were both stripped of their pension rights. Both men were deported to their deaths. As a professor at a university and a law faculty in London, the idea of a student doing such an action seems almost unimaginable, but it happened. As Otto crossed line after line, Charlotte offered unstinting support. She just loved the perks, the Mercedes, the cocktail parties, the concerts at the Salzburg Festival, and being at Bayreuth with the Führer and Himmler. And she loved the new homes, freshly emptied, newly appropriated. In Vienna, they got their own large villa with its own park. Later on Lake Zell, they acquired a small summer house, just 16 hectares, previously owned by the governor of Salzburg, now at Ravensbrück concentration camp. The arrival of war in September 1939 procured a new position for Otto as governor of Krakow in Western Poland, newly occupied by Germany, working under Hans Frank. Charlotte was fully aware of all that he was up to because he wrote about it in the letters home. There's a lot going on here, Otto wrote in December 1939, and tomorrow I have to have another 50 Poles publicly shot. This was a first and notorious act of reprisal killing, contrary to international law, personally ordered by Adolf Hitler. It was Otto who signed off on all the acts against the city's Jews and Polish intellectuals. It was Otto who ordered and oversaw the construction of the Krakow ghetto. For these and the many other terrible acts in which he was involved, he would later be indicted for mass murder. I look for a hint of regret in Charlotta's papers. 8,677 pages, not a hint of regret. 3 years later, the Krakow job completed, Charlotta celebrated when Hitler appointed Otto to Lemberg in February 1942 to clean up District Galicia, recently occupied by Germany. Otto kept her abreast of developments. There was so much to do in Lemberg after you left, he wrote. The harvest was gathered, Polish workers were sent to labor camps, already 250,000 have been sent from my district, and the current large Jewish operations, Judenaktionen, were implemented. That meant there was no one to put powder on the tennis court. Lots of love forever, he signed off. Himmler visited, offering a position in Vienna to check if he wanted to stay. He did want to stay. I was almost embarrassed about how positively Himmler talked about me, Otto writes to Charlotta. But life isn't perfect, as I said, and manual labor was proving to be difficult to find. The Jews are being deported in increasing numbers. It's difficult to find people to work for you. As the deportations and exterminations proceeded, Charlotta wrote of picnics and concerts. And it's this disconnect between the horror and the beauty that makes for so compelling and disconcerting a read. Carefully read, Charlotta's diary reveals many other secrets. Working as a volunteer nurse at a hospital in Lviv, she records in an English that Otto cannot read that she has lost her heart to a young soldier. And in the spring of 1942, as the final solution is being implemented, she actually falls in love with Otto's boss, Hans Frank. I send the pages to Frank's son, Nicholas. Sensational, he responds by immediate and mischievous email by return. Maybe Horst and I are brothers. The letters trace the bitter last months and weeks of the war. Even at the most acute moments, as the Red Army approaches Lemberg and the end nears, Charlotta and Otto find time to write to each other almost every day and to hope. Charlotta remains the Anglophile. Back in 1932, she wrote to Otto, the British are even more nationalist than the German. And Charlotta imagines now, in 1945, the possibility of a new ally in the struggle against the dreaded Bolsheviks, the Soviets, the communists. I do hope, she writes to him, that the English will finally be fed up and will unite with us. But, she continues, there's an impediment. The Jews, always getting involved, contaminating everything. That's right at the end of the war. On the 9th of May 1945, the war is over. And Otto is indicted for mass murder, and he disappears off the face of the earth, literally. His name is in all the papers. He's listed as a wanted war criminal with his friend Seyss-Inquart, who is caught, put on trial at Nuremberg, convicted and executed. To survive, Otto must now rely on Charlotta, and the tables in the relationship are turned. A new chapter opens. Evasion and escape requires new friends and allies in the Vatican and beyond. Charlotta's papers provide secret details of Otto's escape, including the time he spent hiding in the Austrian mountains with a young companion, a former SS soldier called Burkhard Ratline, known as Buko. I asked Horst about Buko. What was he like? What did he do during the war? How did he help Otto? You want to know about Buko? Horst asks. I nodded. Well, he said, I could answer all of your questions, everything you want to know about Buko, or we could just telephone him. Amazingly, this was 2017, and Buko was still alive in his 90s. We went to see Buko a few weeks later, and Buko told me how they hid in the Austrian mountains for 3 years, how they moved from hut to hut, and how they followed the Nuremberg trial in the newspapers that Charlotta brought to them every 2 or 3 weeks. Thus did they learn of the outcome, the convictions, the sentences of death, the hangings of Otto's friends and colleagues, Frank, Seyss-Inquart, and Kaltenbrunner. How did Otto react to the news of the hangings? I ask Bucco. Vi victis, he replies. To the victor, the spoils. And as Bucco is speaking to me, I have my eye on a small black and white photograph on the bookshelf behind him. It turns out to be a seated man, pensive, with a swastika on the armband. It's Adolf Hitler sitting in this guy's room in January 2017. After Otto left Bucco in the autumn of 1948, he slowly made his way south towards the south, via Salzburg and Innsbruck, and then across the Dolomites into Italy. The correspondence with Charlotta provides details. The friends and lovers who provided refuge and other forms of assistance and comfort on the way in Bolzano and elsewhere. The dramatic arrival in Rome, where he was greeted by senior Vatican figures, including, as he put it in his diary, a very positive religious gentleman who had connections right to the very top. From this correspondence, in which all names are anonymized, we eventually worked out, it took many years, who he met and who he hung out with, what the Americans were up to in the Eternal City, who the new friends and allies were, and how the new war, a Cold War, ensnared Otto, and what exactly the Americans knew about his whereabouts and when. The path to the Ratline comes into crystal clear view, and it is one that is deeply surprising and troubling. So troubling, in fact, that I took counsel from my neighbor, who happened to be a writer of spy novels, John le Carré. He invites me to tea. I arrive with 6 small cakes and a handful of Otto's letters and some photographs. We sit in le Carré's living room as the sun streams in across the papers laid out on his sofa and on a low table. And then he says to me, "You know, Philippe, I was there in 1949. I didn't know that," he said. "Yep, I was a young British soldier interrogating Nazis. To prosecute them?" I ask. "No," le Carré replies, "to recruit them. It was bewildering," he explains. "I'd been brought up to hate Nazism and all of that stuff, and all of a sudden, we find that we've turned on a sixpence, and the great new enemy is now the Soviet Union. It was terribly perplexing." That was just 3 years after the end of the Nuremberg trial, and that gives you a different sort of context to International Holocaust Memorial Day. So why did I engage in this project? What is it about the Wächters that captured my imagination? There are no simple answers to these questions, but it seems to me clear the answer goes somewhere to the interrelationship of matters of memory and identity. That's the case for Horst, the memorialization and construction of an image of his parents. And it's the case for me, a journey that I've taken to learn about the untold story of my grandfather, things he would never talk about to me, so that I could better understand who he was and who I am. Memory and identity are important, and I think about them very often indeed. My interest in the Wächters is surely a consequence of the connection with my own family in Vienna and in Lemberg with the Wächters, for Wächter was directly involved in actions that contributed to the mistreatment and extermination of my grandfather's entire family, parents, siblings, cousins, uncles, aunts, and so on. My desire to excavate the memories of others is intended, I think, to fill gaps and to replace the silencers, and that is motivated in large part by matters of identity. But there is too the implications of Otto Wächter's stories for our own modern-day conceptions of justice. Wächter died alone, painfully, in the Vatican-run Santo Spiritu Hospital. He was charged, yes, but he was never convicted. And the fact that he was never convicted has created a space, one that Horst occupies. He says to me, all the guilty ones have been judged. As far as he is concerned, the names of those responsible for crimes have been fully documented, and since none of the lists of those tried and convicted include his father's name, it follows that he must be innocent. Everything else is, as Horst puts it, imagination. And this is the untold story of Nuremberg and every other expression of formalized international criminal justice, one of those unintended consequences of more or less every legislative or judicial act. Inclusio unius est exclusio alterius. To include one is to exclude the other. By memorializing certain facts in the Nuremberg judgment, you inadvertently memorialize the acts of others by silencing them. And this silence allowed Charlotte to live the rest of her life on the constructed and imagined artifice that her husband was a decent man, a reality that she has passed on to her son. As you'll discover, however, in the Ratline, the baton of innocence is not necessarily passed on endlessly to all the future generations. The truth is the truth to the end of reckoning, as Shakespeare put it in Measure for Measure. There is, too, to explain my interest in the Wächters, the connection to my own work, the cases in particular. And this I pondered just a few months ago when I found myself sitting in the International Court of Justice in The Hague as counsel to the Gambia in the case involving the genocide of the Rohingya by Myanmar. I sat literally just a few feet from Aung San Suu Kyi, Nobel Peace Laureate, as she sought to persuade the judges of the ICJ that the Myanmar military's actions against the Rohingya community might be excessive. The odd war crime here and there, perhaps, she grudgingly acknowledged, but most certainly not acts of genocide. None of the 17 judges was persuaded at that interim phase. And how was it, I asked myself, that she could not see the facts as others did? Some who know her believe the reason may lie in matters personal and of family, arising from her relationship with her father, the architect of Burmese independence, the founder of the Tat Mador, Myanmar's armed forces. He was assassinated 6 months before the country gained independence from the British. As she addressed the court, no more than a few feet from me, looking impeccable, with flowers in her hair, speaking so fluently, I thought of Horst and Charlotte. And my interest in the Wächters as individuals. I suppose in some way my interest is connected to the legal issues, to crimes against humanity and genocide. There are individuals and there are groups. And one of the most important groups, of course, is the family. As regards Otto, I begin the book, The Ratline, with a quote from the wonderful Spanish writer Javier Cercas. It is more important to understand the butcher than the victim, he tells me. Why did Otto do what he did? Maybe this is the big question that I'm chasing, and so many have chased. How is it that a highly intelligent, educated, cultured human being could become embroiled in mass murder? These are not questions for the judges, of course, who are only concerned with what he did and did not do. But can we, who are so interested in the formalized delivery of criminal justice, also not be permitted to ask ourselves the bigger question? Why? Warum? Pourquoi? The answers to such questions do not reside in the judgments of courts. They live in the personal archives, in the letters and the diaries, in the poems and in the notes. In the Wächter correspondence, we find the clues. Why lines were crossed. A mix, toxic, awful, of ideology, of ambition, of weakness. But there is another conclusion in my view. Otto Wächter's story is not about the banality of evil, to take Arendt's famous words. Because Otto Wächter knew exactly what he was doing and he wanted to do it. He embraced the horror, and the silence of the family archive is testament to his and Charlotte's awareness of their own involvement in the horrors. What of Charlotte? In many ways, she is the beating heart of the book, the most fascinating of the characters, perhaps also of this family story of international criminality. It's plain from the archive that she knew everything, that she supported everything, that she was complicit. She loved her man, yet she could be angry with him from time to time. As he lies dying in Rome, she writes to him, "Did you come to me when I was ill?" And what of Horst? He's in a state of absolute denial on that which is in the archive and the documents which I have dug up. How do we understand the nature of a son's denial? Love blinds. Over time, it transforms our perceptions of reality, and then it transforms reality itself. Because like me, Horst was born into a family of silencers. When the war ended, he, as his mother Charlotte's favorite, was protected, nourished, loved, and he was taught that his father was a fine and decent man. I'm so grateful that there are still people today who have positive things to say about my husband, Charlotte told a journalist. I do not want my children to believe that he is a war criminal who murdered hundreds of Jews. And Horst doesn't believe it and doesn't want to believe it, even if he knows the facts point in another direction. Together, he and I have stood before a site of mass murder near Lviv, and there the pain on his face is plain. He doesn't deny what has happened or his father's connection to the horrors. He's not a Holocaust denier. He's not a racist. He's not an anti-Semite. He doesn't deny his mother's support of what has happened. He just wants to characterize the facts differently, as Charlotte did. It's a different truth, and it's a different way of being able to live. It's actually, I think, a means of survival. Tomorrow, I have to have 50 Poles shot. One of the documents I've mentioned to you said, a letter from Otto to Charlotte. I show it to Horst. His interpretation, he looks at it, he pauses. He says, you see, Philippe, it says, I have to have them shot, not I want to have them shot. So you've got no proof. But I found the proof. It took 3 years, including 3 photographs, dreadful images that I place at the end of the book. Otto Wächter overseeing the act of execution, the execution of those 50 Poles. The first photo showed a group of 25 young men and boys in the snow waiting to be shot. A second showed the actual moment of execution. And a third showed Otto in charge, a commanding presence in his fine, long, black leather coat. I can't share Horst's characterization of the facts or his version of the truth, yet I somehow can't help but feel some sort of an affection for him. I respect his open spirit. I respect his willingness to engage in my research project, to respond to suggestions that he looted objects his mother passed on to him, and to return those objects to their rightful owners. And I feel too a certain anxiety for the price he has paid for sharing these personal papers with me, which has resulted in him cutting himself off from much of the rest of his family. If I'm able to be generous to him, he who protects the reputation of his father, he who was so deeply involved in the killing of my grandfather's family, it is because I recall a scene early in the film, My Nazi Legacy, when he described his birthday, his 6th birthday. He was a little boy in April 1945. And as he's recalling that birthday, he weeps about the family idyll that was lost. The consequences go on and on. I opened East-West Street with a quote from Nicholas Abraham and Maria Torok from their fine book, Notes on the Phantom, which is concerned with the effects on the descendants of injury or catastrophe felt by the parents. We are haunted by the gaps left by the secrets of others. In the Ratline, the last words are spoken by Magdalena, the granddaughter of Otto and Charlotte, the only child of Horst. Those last words are, my grandfather was a mass murderer. For those words in the book, published last year, Horst has now disinherited his daughter, Magdalena. And just today, remarkably, she posted on YouTube an extraordinary statement of her commitment to International Holocaust Memorial Day. I tweeted it. You can find it on my tweet. Horst and I are bonded by a sense of dislocation and to events in time distant and in place distant. Our points of departure were different. We're on opposite sides of a shared story, yet our paths crossed and somehow we arrived at an end point. For him and I, it's been a curious waltz, a constant movement, a double act in which each seeks to lead and persuade the other. I've tried to persuade him and failed. He's tried to persuade me and failed. What emerges in the waltz are secrets and questions of lies and justice and love. What they mean and what they do to memory and identity is what we recall on this day, but it is, of course, another matter. Thank you so much.
Philippe, I can start really by just thanking you for a talk which was informative, accessible, illuminating, sensitive, and erudite. Quite a combination of factors. It really was a tale of international justice, but really a personal story, which gave it color and depth. 2 points before the questions come that really resonated with me were these. You used a phrase in your talk, memory and identity are very important indeed. And that is so true, because as more and more survivors of the Holocaust perish and their memory lives on, but their eyewitness evidence fades, it is so important that there are records and that those archives are searched and material is found to confront Holocaust deniers. The Holocaust Education Trust pursues that objective, and recently a talk was given by David Miliband, and he made a point which really struck home to me. He mentioned that at the recent storming of the Capitol building 3 weeks ago in Washington, one of those people was wearing a T-shirt which had the slogan on it, or the initials and the number, 6MNE. 6MNE. And that stood for 6 million, not enough. And it is dealing with that sort of behavior that research, studies, evidence, and proof becomes so vital and important. And memory and identity are part and parcel of that. On a lighter note, I was delighted that you gave a name check to Lisa Jardine, who, as you may know, was a master of Middle Temple. She was an honorary bencher. I got to meet her, first of all, when I became a trustee of the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2011. And she was an experienced, long-serving trustee, and she was assigned to me as my mentor. The 2 words that I would use to describe her was boundless curiosity. And I have to say, Philippe, it is something I think you share. Long may it continue. And my first question is, what's next?
Well, Andrew, thank you for those really generous words. I mean, you're right. I mean, Lisa was so thrilled to be a master of Middle Temple. She mentioned it on numerous occasions. I think I came to her call, actually. And she was a remarkable human being. And this part of the project, the Ratline part, would not have happened but for Lisa. She was the one who said, look, this is interesting. Personal documents matter. So it will end up being a trilogy. I'm started writing the 3rd book. Wächter is a minor player in the book East-West Street, and there is a minor player in the Ratline by the name of Walter Rauf. Walter Rauf was Otto Wächter's comrade, and he too escaped in 1945, and he too made his way to Rome, stayed in the same room that Vechte stayed in at the Viña Monastery, but he did get away, first to Syria and then to Ecuador, where in the early 1950s, he met a young Chilean soldier who was stationed in Ecuador named Augusto Pinochet. Ralph, 3 years later, went to Chile, and in 1973, it is said, started working in the service of the new government of Augusto Pinochet, and was engaged, it is said, as an interrogator and torturer. One of the people he tortured, allegedly, wrote an affidavit which became part of the dossier that made its way to London and to my desk in 1998, when Pinochet argued that he was immune from the jurisdiction of the English court. So the next book tells the parallel story of Walter Rauff in Chile and Pinochet in London. In between, that will come out in 2024. In between, I'm doing a book about a case that is very dear to me, involving a place called Chagos. I've acted for Mauritius for years, and a year and a half ago, we got from the International Court of Justice a decision that the United Kingdom's rule of the Chagos archipelago and Diego Garcia was unlawful, and the removal of the entire population of Chagos was unlawful. And I'm writing a short book about decolonization and the story of a single lady, a remarkable lady I've come to know well, Lisby Elise, who was one of the people thrown off by the British in 1973, aged 20, and who wishes to return to her home on a small island in the Indian Ocean called Peros Baños. So I'm actively engaged between the cases and hearings and the other stuff.
That sounds like quite an agenda, but is no surprise. Now, could I ask, Malene, are there any questions?
Yes, there are some questions coming in. I will start off with one that was sent to me privately. Firstly, they would like to thank Master Sands for sharing this account and his life experiences. They say this was truly one of the most captivating talk they had an opportunity to attend, and they're really grateful. Their question is, it is safe to say that you were involved in a multitude of projects and events that made history. Among those many projects and events, which one would you say marked you the most and contributed to the shape who you are as a barrister today?
What a wonderful question, and thanks for the very nice introductory words. You know, I have been very privileged and very lucky. And I'm going to say something that will surprise. I have come to discover there is an inverse relationship between how much you are paid to work on a case and how interesting and significant it becomes. There was one case that I worked on for 2.5 years, pretty much entirely pro bono. And I do want to commend to everyone the vital importance of doing pro bono work. It is part of who we are. It's part of our public service. It's part of our public commitment. But it also, at a purely selfish and intellectual, interesting level, brings us in really interesting cases. The Pinochet case, I did pro bono for Human Rights Watch. And I will never forget the moment in Pinochet number 1, the judgment standing in the Lords, 5 justices, 5 Lords. We went 1-0 down, we went 2-0 down, then it was 2-1, then it was 2-2, and there was only one judge left to speak, and that was Lord Hoffman, and he was the only one we knew was on our side. And at that moment, we suddenly realized the world was going to change, and a former dictator and torturer was not going to get immunity. So that was, let's say, extraordinary moment number 1. Extraordinary moment number 2 was just February 2019, the Great Hall of Justice in the Peace Palace in The Hague, the decision of the International Court of Justice on the separation of the Chagos archipelago from Mauritius, a more or less unanimous ruling from the International Court of Justice that the separation of Chagos and the creation of the British Indian Ocean Territory in 1965 was contrary to international law, contrary to the right to self-determination, and was null and void, and the territory belonged to Mauritius, a case I referred to earlier. It doesn't happen often that you get a decision that was so overwhelmingly one-sided before the International Court, and that was a big moment for me. I think the parallel point that I'd made in relation to the two cases is that ultimately both cases concern the well-being of individuals and groups. And I think the answer to the question is, it is those cases where the human side of the story is so significant that have really attracted me. And that must be in part to do with my own family story. I could mention also the Rohingya case and the experience I described of being there in court with Aung San Suu Kyi. In that case, of course, the genocide that was being alleged was against a Muslim community, the Rohingya, in Myanmar. And I must say, when we got that decision, and it was unanimous, 17-0, ordering provisional measures, that too was a huge moment. So international law is a long and slow game, but there are shards of light occasionally that absolutely keep you going.
If I could pick up on one point that Master Sands has mentioned, pro bono work is really important. I think looking back on my career, two of the most important cases and the most enjoyable ones I have done have been pro bono cases in the Court of Appeal, and they changed the law in relation to sex and race discrimination, respectively. And it was something that I was privileged to have the opportunity to do. One really important objective that I have this year as treasurer is to encourage our members at all levels to do some pro bono work. It's important to remember that access to justice by the poor, the vulnerable, and the underprivileged has been severely impeded by the unavailability of legal aid in most of our civil and immigration cases. Litigants in person are more and more frequently seen in court, and that undermines the rule of law and equality of arms. And that can be remedied by members of this Inn providing their advocacy skill, their legal expertise, their care and energy to assist. And I think that that's something that you really do need to think about. There is a Treasurer's Lecture, our first one, on the 8th of February, which is being given by Sir Robin Knowles and the CEO of Advocate, Rebecca Wilkie. I urge you to attend. So that was my little plug, and I hope you don't mind me, Philippe, doing that. Next question.
Yes, so this one, I'll just read it out. There's currently a case going to the Supreme Court of the United States. It's about the return of art treasures appropriated by the Nazi government during World War II. The US Department of Justice have filed a rather bizarre amicus brief arguing that as Jewish people were German citizens, they were then bound by the laws of the state. Therefore, the taking of the artworks was not illegal under domestic law, and as such was also not illegal under international law. The brief seems to go against 70 years of precedent, not to mention history and morality. And does the panel have any thoughts on that?
Well, I was not aware of that. Thank you very much. If I could ask whoever has asked that question to forward me the brief by email. I'm on UCL and Matrix Chambers. I would really like to see that brief. I mean, I'll form my own view on what it says, but the description that's giving of it is quite disturbing. I have to assume that it was not a brief filed in the past week by the administration of President Biden, and that it is a sort of hangover. I can assure you that if you get me that brief, I will instantly pass it to various people who are in the new administration. The new Attorney General is a superb individual, Merrick Garland, and that brief, if it's correctly described, will not, I hope, remain. I'm really amazed by what I've heard.
Yeah, sorry, that was my question, and it is one that I've put a link, I'll send you it anyway, but I've put a link to the actual brief in the chat, and I'll just, I don't want to take too much time up, but I'll just read you the relevant part that they've said, okay? The exception, and this is the one about suing, because they're supporting the German government in a reparation case. And they're saying the exception, which is that you can't sue sovereign states, the exception, therefore, should not be understood to cover the claims in this case because, as Helmrich observed, quote, a sovereign's taking or regulating of its own national's property within its own territory is often just the kind of foreign sovereign's public act, a jure imperi, that the restrictive theory of sovereign immunity ordinarily leaves immune from suit. So what they're basically, but it's not just the art thing, because if you extend that precedent, they are literally saying that anybody who was, quote, a citizen of Germany, despite the fact they've had all their rights removed, is bound. So you're saying Jewish people were bound by the Nuremberg laws because they were German citizens. So it's all legal. What's the problem? And it's just bizarre.
I think I've given you the answer.
Yes.
And I really want to see it now. And there are plenty of people for me to send it to.
I will send you that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Not to worry, I have emailed it, so Master Sands can have a look at it after.
Thank you.
After the session. I'll move on to the next
question.
It already.
It has arrived already. Fantastic.
The next question is, firstly, they want to say they've really enjoyed your Ratline podcast. They were really captivated by the civility of your relation with Horst von Wachter. Sorry, I can't pronounce it. What advice could you share that would help us develop the sensibility, is the question.
So it's a lovely question also. You know, one of the things I think is that both East-West Street and the Ratline are written by a member of the English bar. I mean, it's really a weird thing to say, but you learn in this community, and I feel very, very proud to be a member of the English bar, to treat people fairly, to treat people respectfully, to keep an open mind, to set things out in a balanced and fair way. And I think it stood me in very good stead on this 10-year journey meeting Nicholas and Horst. And you're not the first to make the observation, how did you keep your cool? Why didn't you lose your rag? I mean, some of it was infuriating, but I think that, from pupillage upwards through to the way you're treated and expected to treat your colleagues in court, I've sort of imbued that sense of decency. I can fundamentally disagree with Horst's views, but I'm also able to see that he's a troubled person, but he's not a malign person. I think it's far be it for me to give advice on how people should proceed. I think what I would say is things are never only what they seem. You have to give people a chance. You have to understand why it is they got to the position that they're in. You can absolutely, as I have with Horst on numerous occasions, express very vehement differences on matters of interpretation and of substance, but aim your thoughts on the substance, not on the deliverer, not on the messenger. And I think that it has been disarming for Horst that I've treated him as I have. And it has meant that it's very difficult, to criticize aspects of the book, which are troubling for some people in many ways, because he's had his opportunity to have his say. I undertook, when I began the project with him, to give him an opportunity, and I would faithfully reproduce his arguments. One of the reviews in the Sunday Times, it was a bit too much repetition. We know what Horst thinks, but that was part of the necessity. Over 10 years, he didn't budge. Indeed, he dug himself in deeper. And I needed to show that, which meant that when he repeated himself, I needed to make that clear. There's a slight price to be paid for that in terms of length and repetition. But I think the moral of the story is stick to the substance and just treat people with respect and courtesy. It stands you in good stead in the end. I happen to be quite an emotional person, so I've really had to control some of my emotions, but I learned how to do that. And I think it is an English barrister's book, or a member of the Bar of England and Wales's book, I think, you know, and the attention to detail, authorities for everything, the endnotes, making sure that I can support every single statement. It's very interesting. Right now, I'm writing a piece for the New Yorker magazine on the extraordinary video statement given by Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's really worth going and seeing. If you haven't seen it, go and watch the Schwarzenegger 7-minute video on YouTube about the storming of the Capitol. It's utterly fascinating. He basically says, I'm an Austrian, I know about these things, be careful. And again, with the New Yorker, you have to justify every single word you put in your article. And of course, the editor said, it's amazing, you've done it. And I said, yeah, because I have to do that when I'm in court. I'm used to doing that. So I think train well, get yourself a good pupil master, pupil mistress, and stick to the rules and the ethical rules, and you'll be fine.
Thank you, Master Sands. I'll move on to the next question. This person was interested in the Le Cara comment. Firstly, they want to thank you for the great talk. Their question is, what were the Nazis recruited into in the UK/common knowledge that many were recruited in America, but not the UK? Did he give details?
Well, I mean, to be honest, what I discovered in writing the Ratline was absolutely shattering in certain ways. In a nutshell, you'll get all of the detail. In 1947, the US Army Counterintelligence Corps set up something called Project Los Angeles. And that's really what John le Carré was. David Cornwall is his real name. That's what David Cornwall was effectively involved in. Project Los Angeles was headed by an American soldier. I met his son, I write about it in the book. And it had as its chief agent, i.e. spy for the Americans, a notorious SS mass murderer. I'm not going to give you his name because that's part of the book and part of the detective part of the book. The chief agent recruited 8 sub-agents, each of whom were paid $50 in cash a month by the American army to spy on activities in Rome and in the Vatican. Who were the 8? 3 of the 8 were senior Nazi SS figures. 3 others were members of the banned Italian Fascist Party, including, unbelievably, the Secretary General of the Italian Fascist Party, who was doing a prison term while simultaneously being paid $50 in cash by the Americans. And the other 2, and this really blew my mind, one of them was a bishop. Again, I'm not going to give you his name because I don't want to give away the secrets of the book, who helped Wächter. He was an American spy. And the 8th, unbelievably, was the chief press spokesperson of Pope Pius XII, who was recruited to work for the Americans. This is 47, okay, just 2 years after the end of the war, because the new enemy has come into view and the British were completely implicated in Project Los Angeles. So the recruitment wasn't to bring people back to England, so to speak. The recruitment was to stop the communists from winning the 1948 general election in Italy or any other election. And to do that, they recruited the former enemy, and it was essentially an anti-communist axis. And the thing is, it's not speculation. We've got the documents in black and white. And again, I don't want to go too far into it because it's in the book, but it's a reasonable supposition that the Ratline was either constructed by or operated by or partly operated by the Americans as a recruitment tool. And that has emerged in other contexts. The famous case of Klaus Barbie, where the Americans in the end had to apologize to the French because it turned out they knew all along that Barbie was being exfiltrated along the Ratline. So it's a really nasty story in many respects.
Thank you, Master Sands. I'll move on to the next question. Is there a certain irony in genocide being treated as a crime of all crimes, when the banality of evil appears to spring from and be normalized by groups, not individuals?
Well, when I started this project, I mean, I had already done cases on genocide and crimes against humanity, but I'd never really thought about the downsides of the concept of genocide, and I've become much more acutely aware of them. First point I'd make is that if an American president says a genocide is happening somewhere, it'll be on page 1 of the New York Times and every paper in the world. But if an American president says it's just a crime against humanity or a war crime, no one will really focus on it. There's no media attention. And that leaves the unhappy consequence that somehow the killing of large numbers of people as a group is worse, and the killing of large numbers of people as individuals, crimes against humanity, is not so problematic. But another theme that I developed, this is more East-West Street, is that, and I've seen this in my own cases, is that by focusing on the protection of groups, and this was a concern of Lauterpacht back in 1945, his concern was that Lemkin's word would replace the tyranny of the state with the tyranny of the group, and it would reinforce the sentiment of group identity, and it would exacerbate or perpetuate or extend into group hatreds. And I have to say that doing some cases on genocide, I've felt that you know, the need to prove the mental intent to destroy a group in whole or in part means that you essentially really put the focus on the group, which is the perpetrators. And I've seen for myself that that reinforces group hatred. So my own sense is that the concept of genocide has had unintended adverse consequences. It will continue to exist. It's obviously a necessary thing because groups do get targeted, but it has a problematic set of consequences, and we need to be aware of that. And right now, where identity politics has become so significant as part of daily political life, I ask myself the question, to what extent has the concept of genocide and analogous consequences sort of fired up the hatreds, so to speak, by reinforcing and giving legitimacy to group identity? But this is a very difficult issue. In East-West Street, most of the book I'm with Lauterpacht and focus on the protection of the individual. But those of you who've read it will know that in the last page of the book, I find myself at a mass grave just outside Lemberg, Lviv, in which there are 3,500 people still today, including my grandfather's family and amazingly Hirsch Lauterpacht's family, commingling, untouched, unmarked, unrecognized. And at that moment, I sort of had a modest epiphany and recognized the absolute truth of what Lemkin was doing, that each of us feels connected to one or more groups in different ways, and the law can properly in some way recognize that. So it's complex.
Thank you, Master Sands. The next question is one back to passed on whilst attempting to escape via the Ratline. However, I'm curious as to the mechanisms that were in play at the time to bring these fugitives to justice. The immediate post-war era must have been very embryonic, and prosecutors must have had very limited tools to actually apprehend the fugitives. Could you shed any light on these early efforts?
I mean, again, I've set out in very great detail with one or two individuals in East-West Street how Hans Frank was prosecuted. I mean, it was extraordinary. I often think about that period from about February, March 1945 to the autumn of 1945, basically in 6 months. They invented everything. Crimes against humanity, genocide. They took war crimes, they created a new thing, crimes against peace, which is war, now today the crime of aggression. They found themselves a courtroom. They created a panel of judges. They did simultaneous interpretation. They did prosecutors. They did lawyers for the defense. Although I'm very sorry to say, and no one's been able to get to the bottom of how this happened. The English bar adopted a ruling that no member of the English bar could act as counsel for the defense at Nuremberg. It's all confirmed and we've got that established, but I've never been able to get to the bottom. Maybe Master Treasurer, in your tenure, you can uncover what happened, who pushed for that. I think it was a mistake. I mean, you know, one perhaps wouldn't wish to act for such people, but it's part of the delivery of justice. And we all know, and we've all done it, and we've all acted for people or entities, perhaps that we don't feel so warm and cuddly to. But the mechanics are extraordinary. And I pay real testament to every single person who was involved in that process. It was a form of victor's justice, but hey, they started from literally zero. It had never happened before, and I'm willing to cut them some slack. And what they did do was, of course, create something. And today, all roads lead to Nuremberg. If there had not been the Nuremberg statute, the Nuremberg trial, the Nuremberg judgment, we would not have international criminal justice today. I would not have been standing in the ICJ a year ago with Aung San Suu Kyi. There would have been no genocide convention, no Yugoslavia war crimes tribunal, no Rwanda. These are all imperfect. We know that, but they're better than the alternative, which is nothing at all. And we have to work on it. And your generation, the generation that's watching this lecture, it will be your job. It will be your job to improve on what we've got. This is a long project, and it will have ups and it will have downs, and then it will have more ups and more downs. And you have to engage. And I encourage all of you to engage in it, criticize it, but criticize it constructively, come up with alternatives rather than just tear it down. It's better than nothing.
Thank you, Master Sands. Thank you for answering all those questions. I have one last question. They're interested in your views as to the current state of world affairs, particularly with regard to the apparent increase in nationalistic views and a lack of tolerance. Does it seem that there is a real risk to humanity at the moment of forgetting the lessons learned from the past? And can the ICC play a part in helping to avoid that?
Well, that's a really very excellent question to finish off with, because it is today of all days that one reflects on, you know, what happened on the negative side, the terrible horrors that happened between 1933 and 1945. But out of those horrors, there was a crack into which the light inserted itself by remarkable individuals like the prosecutors at Nuremberg, like the defense counsel at Nuremberg, like Lauterpacht, like Lemkin, like the inventions of crimes against humanity and genocide. And it reminds us of how crucial that moment was. The generation that was involved in Nuremberg and in the Holocaust is disappearing. And those remarkable first-hand voices we soon will no longer be able to hear. And I do wonder whether, in part, the account given by Master Treasurer of some of the people and their clothing involved in the 6th of January storming of the Capitol, the January putsch, whether in part that has been made possible by the disappearance of that direct experience, which is what makes a day like today so very important. And I do worry right now about the state of the world. I mean, just speaking most locally, I really worry about what happened about this country's commitment to the rule of law. You know, I've mentioned the Chagos case and the International Court of Justice decision. I would never in a million years have expected a British government to say we're going to ignore it, which is what they've done. I would never have expected a British government to propose legislation in Parliament, which on its face violated a treaty recently negotiated, signed, and entered into force on withdrawal from the European Union. I mean, so what's going on? You know, I'm going to go a step further. I am going to go a step further on this important day. We need people in our main law offices who really are going to uphold the rule of law. And if they're not going to, we at the bar, junior, senior, and everyone in between, have to hold those people to account. And we have to have the courage to say, this is not good enough. You have an oath to uphold the rule of law. And the moment you depart from that oath, you are out. You are not fit for office, because that is how it begins. A number of the questions I noticed on the chat are raising a similar point. How could it be that so many lawyers were involved in all of this? And that, I think, is the point I want to end by. We as lawyers, whether we are barristers, whether we are solicitors, whether we are advocates, whether we are attorneys, we have a social responsibility. We have a commitment, not just to ourselves, not just to our client, not just to the judges before whom we appear, but to the very idea of the rule of law. And that is the main lesson, I think, from that 1945 moment. When the lawyers start cutting corners, a lot goes wrong. And that's something I've really taken away from looking at Hans Frank and Otto Wächter, both of whom trained at the finest law schools in Europe, but nevertheless got embroiled in mass murder. It is incomprehensible to me how that happened, but the lesson of Otto Wächter is that once you cross one line, it becomes much easier to cross another. And I think we have to have a common responsibility to call people to account. I do wish the Bar Council had, which was very strong under my very dear friend and colleague from university, the chair of the Bar Council, Amanda Pinto, but I would have gone even further in relation to some of the current office holders, because they essentially waved goodbye to the rule of law, and that is how it begins. And we have to be absolutely firm about that, and we give no leeway at all. But it's on this day that we remember what we do have in this country, which is remarkable judges, remarkable lawyers, an independent legal profession, and institutions like the Middle Temple and the Law Society and the other Inns of Court and so many other law libraries in Scotland and in Ireland and in other places have an absolutely central and key role now more than ever. We can disagree on points of substance, that's absolutely fine. But on the rule of law, we must be firm and we must be principled. And if any of us are asked to do something that crosses a line, you just say no and you walk away from it, period.
Master Sands, it's been a treat. Thank you very much. It is not every day that you get the chance to hear such personal stories from somebody who is a remarkable lawyer and whose work has literally changed the world. So thank you very much indeed. Now the time is just past 8 o'clock, and I'm delighted to say that there are as many people on this call now as there were when it began. And at this time, I don't know if you've read, that as part of the commemoration of the Holocaust Memorial Day, it is customary at 8 o'clock to light a candle, which I have just done. It is designed to commemorate what has happened in the past. And as I said earlier, in these deepest days of lockdown, to inspire a better future. Here's hoping. Thank you very much indeed for attending. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Good night.